The views expressed on this podcast are those of the participants, not of Reuters News.
It's very clear that we're living in a world of rising protectionism. It's clear that the landscape for regulatory intervention around the world is changing very quickly. The definitions of national security are evolving. And whether it's not just the US, but also in Europe and other parts of the world, all the M&A and antitrust lawyers I've been speaking to in the last few weeks have been saying that you don't just have to think about national security anymore, you also have to think about economic security in its broader context.
A near $15 billion cross-border steel merger has just eked its way across the line after a long, drawn-out battle that involved unions and Donald Trump. Earlier this month, the US president signed off Nippon Steel's acquisition of United States Steel. But the White House's unusual means of resolving its concerns sets a worrying precedent. All of this is in this week's Viewsroom. You are very welcome back to the Viewsroom. This is your weekly podcast that invites you into a lively discussion with Breakingviews columnists about the knottiest stories in corporate finance. And I'm your host, Amy Donlan. So this week, I'm flying solo. No Jonathan this week. It was a bit too tricky to coordinate 4 different continents. So while Jonathan has also been fascinated by the story, I get the pleasure of interviewing my 2 guests, Una Galani, Asia editor of Breakingviews, and Anthony Curry, who's an associate editor at Breakingviews based in Melbourne, Australia. So Una and Anthony, you are very welcome.
Great to be here.
Lovely to see you.
You too. So Una, I think, can we just, if you haven't really been paying attention to this deal, it's been rumbling along, as I said, for quite some time, but just for our listeners that are intrigued by cross-border deals, but maybe want a little bit of background, could you just tell us, how did this deal emerge and why is it so contentious?
Yeah, so look, this is a deal to create the world's 3rd largest steelmaker, and it was announced in December 2023. But as you say, it was immediately contentious for several reasons. US Steel is a company that has this kind of iconic status in the US. It's only the 3rd largest steelmaker these days in the US, but it was once the largest steel company in the world. On top of that, steel is increasingly seen as a strategic industry. So for countries like the US that are thinking about self-sufficiency, that's a bit of an issue. And US Steel is a dominant supplier to US automakers and truck makers. So it's kind of predominant, it's got a high profile role there. And finally, really, it was just the timing of it. It was terrible. I mean, this deal with Nippon, and Nippon is Japan's largest steelmaker, emerged right as the US was on the cusp of an election year. So the timing couldn't have been worse. The unions hated it, but it was also opposed by 2 presidents and a presidential candidate. First Joe Biden, then Donald Trump, who called it horrible and he promised to block the deal. And more often than not, for the past 18 months, it really looked as if this deal would never see the light of day. I mean, so the fact that it's now completed, even with a golden share and lots of conditions, is really a huge win for Nippon. And even more so since Trump has doubled tariffs on imported steel to 50%. So that ought to boost the profitability of this American endeavor for them.
Yes, I mean, we'll definitely get to the golden share and the sort of intricacies of this deal, which I think is very interesting. But Anthony, if I could just switch to you, why was the deal so important to Nippon Steel and US Steel? What did they? I mean, obviously Una has touched on some of it, but was there other things that really made this worth fighting for and worth getting through all of this, that kind of political issues?
Yeah, I think if start with US Steel. So, I mean, US Steel was kind of forced into this by having a domestic rival, Cleveland Cliffs, come after it a few months earlier. I think they offered about $7 or $8 billion, so roughly half what they finally got. So, from a board director's perspective, you've got double the price, right? So, you've been offered a deal from a domestic rival that may well not have got past domestic antitrust anyway. And you managed to get a much better price. So they really didn't have much choice. They were forced into it by another player going after them. Also, they were kind of vulnerable. US Steel. They've been investing, finally, they're a little bit late, but investing in electric arc furnaces where you need to use much, if any, coking coal, unlike the old traditional blast furnaces. They're more efficient, they have fewer emissions, carbon emissions coming out, and also it's become a lot easier to use electric arc furnace steel for things like car making, whereas beforehand it was always thought to be just blast furnaces. But by investing in this, they were hitting their profitability, unsurprisingly. And because others were ahead of them on this game, they looked vulnerable. So that didn't help them. But what this did for them was to allow them to have a degree of control. They wouldn't be giving in to a domestic rival. And also, hopefully, the deeper pockets of a larger entity. Nippon Steel has about 3 times the capacity of US Steel for steelmaking. Now, from Nippon Steel's perspective, I mean, look, we can talk about the financials behind it. It looks a pretty poor deal financially for them, even before we get into the golden share and everything else that came up. But look, Nippon Steel is mostly a domestic supplier and producer in Japan. As I said, it's got about 65 million tons of capacity a year. That's been shrinking because Japan's been shrinking. That may change. The economy is coming back. Maybe they'll need more steel. But Nippon Steel has been trying to expand outwards. It has a joint venture with ArcelorMittal in India. But also it set itself a target of having capacity of 100 million tons a year a couple of years ago. Not really completely sure when that target is meant to be hit by. But what they get with this deal is a sudden boost of 25 million tons of capacity. So it sort of helps them along their way to their goal, as well as helping them to expand. And also there are some other issues with China as well, which this may possibly help with.
Yes, I was just going to ask you about, because China is also, in the background of this deal as well. So what role did the sort of the overcapacity issue in China play in this deal?
Well, it's unsure what it plays on the US side, so we'll put that aside for 1 second. On the Japanese side, Nippon Steel and others have been quite concerned about increasing exports from China. Now, China makes, let's say, roughly 1 billion tons of steel a year. That's more than half of the market. And most of that was for domestic consumption. It's basically in China what steel was to America 150 years ago. Think of all the robber barons, Andrew Carnegie, all those guys. Steel has become in China what it was in America almost. But the bursting of the property bubble a few years ago took a lot of that excess capacity away that was needed. You still got a lot coming through from infrastructure, electric vehicles and other vehicles, wind farms, you name it. There's a lot of demand there. But because there's less demand from property, what you've seen is a falling in the price of steel, a fall in the demand. And as a result, from 2020 to 2024, exports doubled to just over 100 million tons. Doesn't sound a huge amount, right? That's the increase is about 7 or 8% of global domestic traded supply. But at the margins, it's got some people, certainly in this region and in Japan, quite concerned that there could be dumping of cheap steel. The other factor is that up to 95% of steel mills in China aren't profitable. So, what does a pseudo-communist society do when it can't make money? It tries to sell off whatever it can, right? So there's fears there. So Nippon Steel has been complaining a fair bit. I think India's also been, a lot of Indian steelmakers have been complaining about the fear. That's not so much the case in the US. In the US, the tariffs in 2018 that Trump's first administration put on effectively stopped most of the direct imports. I think there's now about 500,000 tons of imports from China, which is 1% of imports, 2% of imports. So very small. There might be some indirect stuff coming through, but from what we've been told, a lot of what is being exported by China is being used in the market it's being sent to. So it's not really impacting realistically the US market. The price might be a bit, it's a global price often. But I think a lot more of it's good political fodder for us America First Trump administration.
And it's actually worth pointing out that Nippon had ended a joint venture with a Chinese company, a 20-year-long joint venture, in the process of not really, it wasn't part of the agreement of this deal, but in the sort of 18-month period between announcing it and actually getting it through, that joint venture ended.
Okay. And Una, I mean, I think it'd be good to kind of now get into the nuts and bolts of this deal and what sort of made it interesting and, as we said at the very beginning, sort of setting a precedent for others. So can you talk us through the sort of, the intervention of Donald Trump and what exactly he managed to extract in this deal?
Okay, yeah. I mean, look, Trump is allowing this deal to proceed, but the US government is going to have a golden share in the enlarged company, and there is a national security agreement overpinning the whole thing. And ultimately, what that means is the US will have very, very powerful veto rights over lots of things. So Nippon will need presidential sign off on reducing or delaying investments and closing or idling plants. The US government will also have influence over employee salaries, overseas sourcing and acquisitions. And Nippon has also pledged to invest $11 billion in fresh investment. I mean, most of this stuff goes well beyond the types of things that are typically asked of companies to mitigate from national security risks. So this is a deal that was highly politicized to start with, and it's got a highly politicized outcome. Um, that said, I think that will this set a precedent for M&A in the US? I mean, obviously, it will cast a chill over M&A. The US has traditionally not taken any kind of stake like this or a golden share in a company unless that company was in a crisis or and this is not that case. It's also not as we've already pointed out, it wasn't the largest steel company in the US either. So whether it is or isn't strategically important to the US is an open question. I think these are really onerous restrictions for a company that is going, as Anthony explained, through this quite expensive and costly tech transformation to these, electric arc furnaces. So, you know, does this deal still make sense? Is a question that people really need to answer. And as Anthony's also pointed out, the returns on this investment were never that attractive to begin with. But for Japanese companies, that's not really the issue. I mean, Japanese outbound M&A is kind of this like super trend that just is resilient to everything. The yen can be up or down. The political environment can be horrible, but Japanese companies will keep buying companies in the US. And increasingly, they'll focus on the US because they can't really look at China because of the slowing economy in China and US China tensions. So, is it going to slow down Japanese M&A? Probably not. I think we're on track for a record year of outbound Japanese M&A. It's like $70 billion year to date of announced deals. That's extraordinary. But will it cast a chill over other outbound M&A from other countries into the US? Yeah, I think it will probably make people think twice. What kind of conditions are we going to be faced with? And
Which I think, Una, is so interesting, right? Because Trump has imposed these tariffs, and the idea is you get around these tariffs. What the message he has sent to companies around the world is you move your manufacturing to the US. I assume that also means really you become more US, you buy a US company, you avoid these tariffs, which would, everyone is expecting this huge, I guess, flood of M&A to take advantage of that. But if in the process of that, you end up having to give up some of the company to the US government, you have to have all these kind of restrictive measures included in a deal that erodes some of the benefits, and maybe the financials were kind of ropey to begin with. You kind of have to wonder, does that sort of take away that, I don't know, that encouragement or that lure of the US?
well, again, I think like time will tell because I mean, people will be tempted, the optimists will be tempted to say, well, this was an election year. Nippon Steel kind of, they bit off more than they could chew. It's probably a one-off and let's all just move on. And um but I think um, um, but I think for other companies, I just don't think it, we're gonna it's very clear that we're living in a world of rising protectionism. It's clear that the landscape for regulatory intervention around the world is changing very quickly. The definitions of national security are evolving. And And whether it's not just the US, but also in Europe and other parts of the world, all the M&A and antitrust lawyers I've been speaking to in the last few weeks have been saying that you don't just have to think about national security anymore, you also have to think about economic security in its broader context. There used to be a time when we would think about just the defense industry and the media industry as types of things that you wouldn't invest in, but now it's really can be anything and everything. So everything is that's evolving very quickly, and we don't know where that will settle down. But you're right. Ultimately, and this was the issue in Tokyo that people kept bringing up, is that Donald Trump is asking people to reshore manufacturing. Here is a company who's proposing something that almost seems to ostensibly fit with exactly what he is asking of foreign companies to do. And yet it's been through 18 months of quite hellish time and sort of multiple rounds of CFIUS review and the the foreign investment review process in the US, and walked away with, I don't know. I mean, if you're really unkind, you could say quite humiliating deal conditions.
Yeah, it is. It's. I mean, if you're thinking about it purely from a financial perspective, or as a manager's and executive's perspective, you've gone from buying a company that was going to give you pretty low returns anyway. Although to be fair, Nippon's cost of operation isn't that high compared to some Western companies. But you've now got these extra add-ons. I mean, the 11 billion, I think they might have thrown that out themselves, like the 11 billion investment as a way of trying getting the deal. But that's 5 times what US Steel's been investing on an annual basis itself. So that's a lot you're throwing out there, which will crimp your returns even more. And then you don't have the ability or the visibility to know if and when you can do what you might need to do whenever you need flexibility when the operation isn't going as well as you'd like, which, steelmaking in the US has been a declining business for a long time. Right. So that puts Nippon Steel in a pretty tricky position. I'd throw out as well, and I haven't thought this through completely, but if one of the reasons that steel was potentially on the upswing in the US was because you had things like the CHIPS Act and the IRA under Biden, which was trying to boost domestic production across the board on so many things. And suddenly we're now looking at a big, beautiful bill that is meant to undermine, if not scrap, a lot of that. So where you're not going to be spending money so much on wind farms. Maybe there won't be as many cars being made, so electric vehicles. The demand for steel may possibly not expand as much as Nippon Steel was thinking 2 years ago. So you got that to contend with as well. I mean, there may be offsets to that. I'm sure there'll be more military spending, although military spending hasn't been for steel that big. At the margins, it helps, not a huge amount. But yeah, it leaves Nippon Steel looking. Well, if I were them, I'd be pretty nervous for the next few years.
Well, their investors have actually already voted with their feet a little bit. It's quite interesting. It's extraordinary, but the share price of Nippon Steel is substantially lower today than it was when they announced the offer to buy US Steel 18 months ago.
Well, it's also worth pointing out that US Steel's financials last year were not good. So revenue dropped by around 13-14%, and core earnings basically halved. Doesn't, and that could be part of a cycle, but it doesn't look good.
No.
So
I think for this deal anyway, obviously this deal, as you said, Una, has kind of got over the line. They have approved it. The US have approved it. But I think for us and for our listeners, what will be interesting is to see, as we're saying, is does this set a precedent? Do we start to see other deals in a similar ilk? And I think we'll hopefully have you guys on to talk about the next deals that come. So Una, Anthony, thank you so much for your time.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy.
Thanks for tuning in. This podcast was produced by Cheryl Pena in New York and Gregory Garner in Toronto. You can listen to a new episode of The Viewsroom every Thursday on the Reuters app or your favorite platform. And don't forget to tune in to our sister podcast, The Big View, every Tuesday, as well as the other great podcasts from the Reuters team. If you like what you heard, please follow The Viewsroom and let us know what you thought. And check out our views on the biggest stories in business and finance every day at breakingviews.com and reuters.com.